For a few weeks there, we were able to sit down and have kind of a common theme every time we did the Monday edition of the Morning Pitt after a game weekend. We could say, well, it's Monday morning and Pitt's still 5-0. Well, it's Monday morning and Pitt's still 6-0. It's Monday morning and Pitt's 7-0. And then there was a little hiccup last week. We had to sit down and say, well, it's Monday morning and Pitt's 7-1. And now, after the second hiccup in 2 weeks, a hiccup that, despite being a 5-point loss as opposed to a 23-point loss, actually looks worse than the loss that came before it. It's a little bit harder to sit down and say, well, Pitt's still 7-2. It's very much the truth that the Panthers are 7-2 overall. They're 3-2 in the ACC, which is a little bit less inspiring. But 7-2 is a great record through 9 games. The best, up there with some of the best seasons we've seen in the 21st century. I think after 9 games, they were 8-1 in 2009. After 9 games, I think they were 7-2 in 2021. I mean, some of the best seasons we've seen, again, in the 21st century and really dating back to the 1980s, this start has rivaled it at 7-2 through 9 games. But as we always say, as we always do, there's context to point out, and details, and background, and caveats. Sticky, annoying little caveats. Like the sneaking suspicion and concern and fear that this team's 7-0 record was built on winning certain types of games. Now, in that 7-0 record, when they went 7-0 to start the season, they defeated 5 power conference teams. We're not going to pretend like they didn't. All right? And we're not going to pretend like the wins at Cincinnati did not happen. Or the win at Cincinnati, the win over West Virginia did not happen. The win at North Carolina, we're not going to pretend like those wins didn't happen. Cal and Syracuse, 5 victories against their first 5 power conference opponents, in addition to beating Kent State and Youngstown State. We're not going to pretend like those things didn't happen. But we also can't pretend, and if we were pretending up until this point, we can no longer pretend that there are other sort of separations in this schedule that you can look and say, well, yeah, they went 7-0. They went 5-0 against their first 5 power conference opponents. Those things are all true, but there's been a marked change in this team's performance, particularly on offense, over the last 4 games. And while we could look at it and say, well, that's still better than half the season, the first 5 games they played really well on offense, and somehow the North Carolina game doesn't get included in that. People say, it was only the first 4 games. No, I mean, they still played pretty well on offense in the North Carolina game. They scored 34 points. Eli Holstein had 300 yards and 3 touchdowns. And so they played well in that game. And so it's 5 games of good offense and 4 games of not so good offense. We can still make that separation, but then once we start getting into the power conference conversation, it gets a little bit tougher, because now, where, you have 5 games of good offense and 4 games of bad offense, against power conference competition, you have 3 games of good offense and 4 games of bad offense. And then we could parse it even further and say, to be completely honest, even though they had 3 games against power conference competition where they had good offense and 4 games where they had bad offense, the reality is, even in those 3 games when they had good offense, they didn't exactly have 60 minutes of it. They didn't exactly have 2 full quarters of it. In the case of the Cincinnati game, it was really the final 20 minutes. The West Virginia game, they were able to keep throwing some punches here and there. The North Carolina game, they were largely able to answer what the Tar Heels did and put points up on the board. I thought that was probably, in retrospect, probably their most complete game of the season. But maybe there were some holes showing all along. And certainly the more savvy Pitt fans among us, and savvy's one word we could use to describe them, but there's certainly many words we could use. Perhaps the more savvy Pitt fans among us have been calling for Pitt's demise basically from the start. And for those fans, it wasn't a question of whether Pitt would fall apart. It was a question of when Pitt would fall apart. And you'll forgive me if I think that might even be some twisted psyche of a Pitt fan that takes pleasure in the ultimate falling apart, because pressure gets scary. Pressure and expectations and success, they get scary. They weigh you down about the looming fall, the inevitable fall. And it's almost like the last 2 games have provided a certain segment of the Pitt fan base with a sigh of relief. At least they're no longer winning. I can get back to complaining, because it was harder to complain when they were 7-0. Now with 2 losses in a row, both with the team looking pretty poor in a lot of areas for most of the games, you can sort of settle back in to that resignation and contempt. But this isn't about the fans. This is slightly about expectations, and it's mostly about where this team is now coming out of 9 games with 3 games left to play. And our Monday morning episode of the Morning Pitt is always a Monday thoughts on Saturday's game, and that's what we'll focus on. We'll talk mostly about this Virginia game, but the reality is we can't talk about the Virginia game without the larger context of the season, without placing that game in the context of the 7-0 start and the 0-2 stretch since starting 7-0. We can't talk about that game without placing in the context of what's to come in the final 3 games of this season, the final 3 weeks, 3 big games. Clemson at home this weekend, at Louisville next weekend, at Boston College to close things out. I mean, this Saturday is the final home game of the regular season. I don't even need to say regular. It's the final home game of the season. And this season that had gotten off to such a start that seemed magical at times has now taken a decided turn for the worst. And probably one of the biggest questions we're going to be asking all week is this Pitt team finding its level? Is water finding its level? I said that a lot on Saturday night on the postgame show after the game. Is water finding its level? And that's one of those sort of stupid cliches that everybody understands what it means. That you are playing at a certain level, either above or below where you really kind of are, and eventually you sort of end up where you really are. And, in the case of Pitt, maybe they were above their level for a bit. And they're coming back down to earth and arriving back at the place that they probably should have been to start the season. Maybe the place that they actually were to start the season. Maybe it ultimately comes down, you find your level, and whatever you want to say this team's level is, it's 7-5, it's 8-4, something like that, fine. And then the way you raise above that or fall below it is when a couple key calls or key plays go your way or don't go your way. And think of stuff like Dejon Reynolds makes that ridiculous catch against West Virginia. Great play. Entirely unsustainable, but great play. Cincinnati gives Pitt a 3rd down conversion with a disconcerting signals penalty at a crucial point in the game. Those things happen. That's part of it. But those are ultimately what sort of move you. Those kind of plays either for or against you, or what will move you above or below your level. And whatever this team's level was, and if you want to say it's 7-5, that this is ultimately a 7-5 team that happened to get some good breaks and make some big plays to get to 7-0, okay. I could buy that. You want to say this is an 8-4 team that happened to get some good breaks and make a couple key plays that helped, that got them to a 7-0 start. Okay, I can buy that. I think where they are right now, though, with 3 games left to play, is not to resign themselves, and not that they ever would, but not to resign themselves to a 7-5 season or an 8-4 season, to keep pushing for 9 wins in this regular season, which I still think, despite what we've seen out of this team over the last 2 weeks and what we've seen out of this offense over the past 4 games, I still think is in reach to get to 9 wins. I really do. Because, again, you find your level, but you can punch a little above your level if you get a couple of those plays to go your way. So you get that crazy touchdown catch against West Virginia. You get the penalty against Cincinnati. You get all those interceptions and pick sixes, which are not typical plays that you can count on against Syracuse. Well, now you just sort of beyond the paled yourself to a certain level. And if 1 or 2 of those games go differently, and this team is sitting here at 5-4 after 9 games, still very much with an 8-win season in reach, we're talking about this team differently. Things just didn't go their way, and I'm sure nobody's feeling good about it. But in a way, climbing the mountain as high as they did at 7-0 made the fall even greater, and raised the expectations probably beyond the level that was reasonable. I mean, there we were on Saturday afternoon after Miami lost to Georgia Tech, and we're sitting there talking about scenarios that could, what tiebreaker advantages would Pitt have against Miami? I mean, we were having that conversation. We were having that conversation because at that point, Pitt was sitting with 1 conference loss, just like Miami. So that conversation about Well, what would be the tiebreakers? And we've, everybody figured them out. Chris Carter at the Post-Gazette did a good job laying it out for everybody, and all the rest of us Googled it, and it's I understand why we looked into that, but this team's 7-0 start raised the expectations high enough that we were having those conversations. And then when you have a game like Pitt just had, in 2 games like Pitt just had, in 4 games like Pitt has had in the last 4 contests, the last 4 outings, it's a stark fall from the 7-0 start, and it makes it's abrupt. And the expectations that had climbed higher and higher, and let's be honest, after the 7-0 start, after the Syracuse game, the expectations were far higher than they were in the preseason. Again, I've said since August, I predicted this would be an 8-win team, either 8-4 in the regular season with a loss in a bowl to a power conference team, or 7-5 in a regular season with a win in the bowl against a MAC team. That's what I said in August, and even my thoughts on this team and expectations for this team changed as they kept winning, because they were getting away with a few games. They were pulling out wins. I don't want to say in a lucky way, because you create your own luck, and I don't want to diminish the play that these players made, the plays they made, everything about it. They earned those wins, and because they had stolen a few games, and I think it's fair to say stolen, because it's still an action on their part. We're not saying it sort of just fell into their lap. They stole a few games. Because they stole a few games, I thought, okay, they might be able to push ahead. I thought this was an 8-win team, but that was an 8-win team where a couple of the losses happened in games where they just couldn't steal them. And if they were going to get above 8 wins, they would need to steal a few. Well, they stole a few. So they should be positioned to get above 8 wins. But unfortunately for Pitt, you want to be peaking at the end of the season, and they're doing sort of the opposite. What's the opposite of peak? Hammett? No, that's not fair. That's a discredit to our good friend Jim. We're not going to make Hammett the opposite of peak, but you get the joke. Look, they're doing the opposite right now, and that's not where you want to be going into your final 3 games. Look at this. We're already 12 minutes in. I haven't even played the music. You know what it is? It's the Morning Pitt. We have a lot of things to talk about. And so, a long intro, it's not even an intro at this point. It's halfway through the episode. But in order to make the rights holders happy, we don't have any rights holders, we still have to play the music. So welcome to the Morning Pitt, the Monday edition, with our Monday thoughts on Saturday's loss here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Yeah, the Monday edition of the Morning Pitt here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. I'm Chris Peak from Panther-Lair.com. You know all those things. You know what I'm going to ask you to do. Like this video and subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com so you don't miss any of our Pitt video content. All right, I want to dive back into it. That's the big picture stuff, everything I just talked about there. Let's talk about the game against Virginia. I said this on Saturday night, and I think one of the biggest storylines right off the bat for this game was the reshuffling on the offensive line. Ryan Baer moved from right tackle to left tackle. Terrence Enos moved inside from left tackle to left guard. And Isaiah Montgomery, redshirt freshman, stepped in. I think he's a redshirt freshman. He might be a redshirt sophomore. I'm going to have to look that up. Isaiah Montgomery stepped in at right tackle, made his first career start. And that was the offensive line they went with for basically the entire game. I think Lyndon Cooper missed one snap when he got hurt. Terrence Moore stepped in for him, but I think on the next play was the end of the drive. And on the next drive, Lyndon Cooper was back out there. So they went with the same offensive line for the entire game, essentially, which I think is more than probably they've done all season, where they sort of have rotated Ryan Jacoby and Jason Collier in most games at left guard. Jacoby and Collier didn't play at all at left guard. It was all Terrence Enos with, again, Ryan Baer next to him at left tackle. And like I said this on Saturday night after the game on the post-game show. Earlier, before the game, we started getting an indication that this change-up was coming. And I remember, when I first kind of heard about it and then saw it in the warm-ups, the first thing I really thought, the first thing that really occurred to me was, wow, this is a 7-1 team. 8 games in the season, 2/3 of the season down. They're 7-1, and they are undergoing a major reshuffling of the offensive line. Like, how often has that happened that a team in that position has taken that drastic of a measure? And that was one of the words I just kept thinking was drastic. I mean, you changed 3 out of the 5 spots on the offensive line. And even if 2 of the guys were starters already and you just changed positions, you're still changing 3 out of 5 spots on the offensive line at this point in the season. And not because you're 2-5 or 2-6 or 3-4 or something like that, or 3-5. You're 7-1. You're having success, but your offense is struggling so mightily and has struggled so mightily for the 3 games leading into Saturday that you went and made a drastic change. And the word drastic kept coming to mind, and the word desperation kept coming to mind. And I think sometimes the desperation move gets a bad rap. I really do. I think sometimes there are situations that call for a desperation move, right? Desperate times call for desperate measures. I think desperate measures are okay. I don't think they're necessary. I mean, they're certainly not a sign of resignation, right? You don't give up. You don't make a desperate measure as a way of giving up, or you don't give up as by way of making desperate measures or drastic actions. You do those things because you believe you could be better. You believe that you don't need to lose. You believe you can win and should win. But it's going to take something different than what you're doing right now. And so it's desperation. I remember back to 2013, if you recall, Pitt was 2014, Pitt was in a pretty rough spot. They had lost to Akron and Iowa and I want to say Virginia as well. And they had an off week, and they came out against Virginia Tech at home and ran almost a version of a Wildcat offense with Chad Voitek. Like direct snaps. I still, as clear as day, can remember Pitt's first offensive play of that game, and they lined up in the shotgun. And I turned to whoever was sitting next to me at the time and said, holy, this is a family program, so we're not going to say the words, but holy, you know what? They're in the shotgun on first down. I couldn't believe a Paul Chryst offense would be in the shotgun on first down. It was a desperate measure because those desperate times called for desperate measures. And so it's not a sign of resignation. You're very much saying we need to do something in order to improve. And if we have to do something drastic, we will do something drastic. And to me, changing 3 out of your 5 offensive line starters 8 games into the season when you're 7-1 is a drastic measure, made even more so by the fact that you're winning. Like your team, yes, they were coming off a loss, but it's not like the team was, again, they're not 3-5, going into that one. They're 7-1. And so a successful team, a team that's winning, felt compelled or driven by their offensive struggles and felt that their offensive struggles were so severe that they needed to make that kind of change. Now, I don't know that the immediate returns on that change were all that encouraging. Obviously, a lot of penalties. Ryan Baer was called for 3 holding penalties. At least 1 or 2 might have been legit. I think Isaiah Montgomery had a holding call. I think Terrence Enos had I wrote all these things down. Why do I lose my writing papers? Terrence Enos, I want to say, had a false start maybe. There were a few things. There were a lot of things, actually, that went wrong. The offensive line had its issues for sure on the penalty front, and I don't know if they necessarily blocked all that well. Pitt was able to get time every now and then for the quarterbacks, and Desmond Reed was able to find some space here and there, but it wasn't consistent enough, so you didn't get an immediate improvement. But I don't know how much immediate improvement is realistic. Oh yeah, Montgomery was called for a holding. I found my paper. Enos was called for a false start. Baer was called for 3 holding penalties. And that's it on the offensive line. That's still 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 penalties on the offensive line, in addition to a delay of game, which isn't necessarily on the offensive line, even though I believe it came out of a timeout or a stop clock situation. But I digress. I don't know if I don't know how much you expect in terms of instant improvement from making those changes. I would assume they're going to stick with those guys again next week and hope that it improves and hope that they get better. But it does speak to the state of the offense that a change like that was made. Now, I think the change a lot of Pitt fans were hoping for, or at least a decent segment were looking for, was at quarterback. And you didn't get that until Eli Holstein got knocked out of the game. Then you got Nate Yarnell into the game. And Yarnell, in his playing time, completed 4 of 12 passes. That's, my math is correct, 33%, for 44 yards, 1 touchdown, and 2 interceptions. So less than 4 yards per attempt. Took 1 sack. Had a couple nice throws. And in a way, it was sort of similar to Eli Holstein. To be completely honest, Holstein was 10 of 23, so at least a little bit closer to 50%, for 121 yards, no touchdowns, no picks, 2 sacks. Both guys made some nice passes. There were a couple passes that I thought both guys, wow, hey, that looks pretty good. That's the kind of thing they need to build off of. And both guys had some absolute head scratchers. The 2 interceptions were bad by Yarnell. Eli Holstein had a pass. Finally he gets a good, clean look at Kanate Mumfield, and he throws it at his feet. And on a play that would have gained a lot of yards. I don't know if it would have gone all the way for a touchdown, but it would have gained a lot of yards. And he throws it at his feet. Quarterbacks are missing. The offensive line is shuffling guys around, doesn't really block out that well. Oh, the receivers are dropping passes too. I think I counted 6 or 7. Well, Panarduzzi said 6 or 7 dropped passes in that game on Saturday night. Officially, there were 4 drops according to the official stat book. My notes, the old legal pad, I wrote down the word drop like 6 times. So, show me who's playing well on this offense right now. Kenny Johnson? Kenny Johnson. That's all I got is Kenny Johnson. Gavin Bartholomew finally scored his first touchdown, so maybe we'll say him, but Gavin Bartholomew. Kenny Johnson. That's it. Nobody's playing well. Quarterbacks are struggling. The offensive line is struggling. The running backs aren't really finding anywhere to run. The receivers are dropping passes. And I think, it extends to the sideline too. Whatever is going on, something worked in the first 5 games. Something worked with this offense in the first 5 games that has not been working in the last 4 games. And at some point, I can buy execution. I can say the offensive line was an issue. I can say the quarterback's missing open receivers. I can say the receivers are dropping passes. I can say all these things. But there's also a scheme issue where when Eli Holstein or Nate Yarnell had time, they still weren't finding those open receivers because those guys weren't there. Now, I know we can be Twitter all 22 guys and we can find that open receiver on every play, and a lot of times we have to look to what was probably like the 5th option on that play. It's highly unlikely the quarterback's ever going to get through his reads to that point. You need to scheme some easy stuff, man. I think they did a great job early in the season scheming some easy stuff, some easy completions. Cade Bell wanted to lead the country in first downs largely by just picking away and picking away and picking away and then eventually hitting that big shot. Well, they're not successfully picking away right now. And the result is the offense has been downright awful for the last 4 games with a few fleeting moments of success. It's been awful. And if they don't figure out how to get it back to just being okay or even good, these next 3 games, whatever goodwill you build up, and I don't actually, I'm not even going to get into the goodwill because the goodwill thing is stupid because, another victory, they'll love you in the morning, right? I think that's how they said it in Scarface. And when you lose, they hate you. So, the goodwill thing, I don't know. Fans showed up on Saturday night. I think they announced close to 57,000 for attendance. This game against Clemson on Saturday should draw a big crowd. I don't know if Pitt fans are going to show up or not. They like to find excuses not to. But I don't know what goodwill means or doesn't mean, or if it's lost or if it's gained. Ultimately you got to go out and make those plays, and if you go out and make the plays, the fans will support you. So that's how you get your goodwill. But I think there's something more hanging in the balance in these final 3 games, and it's the chance for a good season. I never thought we would be at this point where you'd be like, man, you guys got to get another couple wins here to really lock this thing in. What seemed like a sure thing of a good season. And so there's a lot riding on it. I think there's a lot riding on these 3 games. You need a boost into next season. You need to find a way to get Eli Holstein back on track if he even plays against Clemson on Saturday. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I really thought a lot of that work would be getting done in the week between SMU and Virginia. And by the results, not a whole lot did. Not a whole lot was done. So we didn't even talk about the defense, but we'll get into that. We got all week to talk about these things. That's what we'll do. Of course, Pitt basketball tonight. Panthers take on Gardner-Webb. Third game of the season. Real challenge on Friday night. We really didn't even get a chance to talk about basketball here, but a good challenge for the Panthers against Murray State on Friday night. A talented veteran guard-led team who really, I think, gave Pitt more of a test than they were expecting, at least the players. And I think that's a good thing, because they've been a little tested now. We'll see what they do against Gardner-Webb tonight. We'll talk about it on the Morning Pitt tomorrow, in addition to all the football talk as we move through the week and get ready for Pitt Clemson on noon at Saturday. On Saturday at noon. All right, get my words together. Look, man, it's a long weekend. These late night games knock me out, so I'm glad to have a noon game this coming Saturday. Look, do me a favor, like this video and subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. That way you don't miss any of our Pitt video content. And then, go check out the website, Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com for all the Pitt sports news you can possibly handle. Thanks so much for tuning in today. I hope you had a great weekend aside from the game on Saturday night. And enjoy your Monday. Get your week off to a good start. We'll catch up with you tomorrow for the Morning Pitt right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.